Well, you've read that democracies don't make war on each other, and for the most part, that's true.
Okay.
And so, good governance in countries that are adjacent to each other, first of all, tends to reduce conflict between those countries. Intrastate conflict is reduced again by the level, arguably by the level of good governance, by the lack of corruption that exists at each level of that society. Essentially, you could run through a list of factors that contribute to the common usage of the term failed or fragile state, and come up with the opposites of those factors, if they're in evidence, to determine whether or not that state is stable, and hence the likelihood of how low the levels of potential levels of conflict are. So you would have to have rule of law within these states. You couldn't have heavy levels of corruption. Although I lived in Europe, and I saw evidence of corruption in different Western European countries, let alone European countries. And then when you start thinking about it, you realize that even within our own domestic politics in Canada, all the scandals that has to do with corruption, and you realize that there's evidence of that as well. The same way with our American friends. Down in New Orleans with the dikes for to combat the floods, that money was used for other purposes, and so corruption is in evidence there, and it is at each level of government. But in the Western democracies, it tends to be at largely manageable levels, whereas in countries that are unstable, are characterized by rebellions, civil wars, etc., it appears that there's a lot more corruption. There's no rule of law. Obviously, there's no religious freedoms. The army tends to be in charge, and there's a lot of use of brute force. The country may not be able to control its own borders. The public does not benefit from public services like we have, in Ontario, for example, our healthcare program in Canada. And as I think I mentioned earlier, there's no freedom of worship, so that's a big dissatisfier. There's huge issues with the environment in a lot of these places. I mean, you take Haiti, for example, where you have corruption, they do have freedom of worship, but they don't have public services, and they have weak governance and corruption, and the police is suspect there. So there's been rule of law issues for a long time, and some ethnic divisions, and then you have people in the higher echelon monopolizing power and abusing power.
Okay.
So those are the basic conditions, I think, that create the opportunity for states to break down and conflict to break out, and the peace quotient goes way down.